Before we get started, let me just mention a couple caveats. There's not, to my knowledge, a scientific literature on this topic. There are some articles and some book chapters on it, and I will share some of those, some of the insights from those articles and book chapters. But much of this is also going to be about my experiences. So that means rather limited to just me. And that's why I wanted to have a conversation to get others to share their points of view on this topic. Now, for me, this has been very personal. I've been in this industry for over 30 years. And even going back to doctoral student days, the idea of publishing and how to publish and why my papers were rejected continuously, almost all the time, and learning how to kind of crack that nut of publications became a very interesting challenge for me, an important one too. And I think that any conversation we can have about this to help you will be a very beneficial one. And I hope we're able to do that today. Anyway, let me just tell you that limited contribution is often cited as a reason for rejection. And this is a very important, even though reviewers may believe that other problems can be fixed. And a colleague of mine, Sarah Rynes, we were co-editors or co-associate editors at County Management Journal early in 2002, as you can see here from Sarah's reference, is that this initially, this statement initially may be a surprise because we often think we can fix these various issues and that's really what matters. But contribution is its own separate part of a paper. And we have to think really hard about what contribution is. And it's different than simply addressing issues with theory, measurement, analysis that we may think, oh, we can address those and make them better. We have to think hard about contribution. And that's what motivated me to think about ways I could succeed when I was going through as an assistant professor, as a PhD student, and so on. But anyway, just to give this some organization today, I want to have a directed conversation so we can make some progress and not just go all around the board and so on. So I want us to be somewhat semi-structured. So I have this organized for 3 different segments. I'll speak for about 10 minutes on each segment, and then provide about 15 minutes or so for conversation. And then at the end, we should have another 15 minutes for additional conversation too. Now, just some caveats. Others have written on some of these topics too, and it's important to read what they have to say. I'll provide my views, but there are others. Although this isn't a scientific literature, as I mentioned, there's other good insights, many good insights that you'll find from other studies and articles on this. And also my focus is on theory development journals. So big tent theory testing journals, County Management Journal, Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science, those types of journals is really what I'm going to be talking about today. The 3 topics I'm going to take us through. The first one will be misperceptions of contributions, and then presenting your contribution, and then finally reviewing and editing. And as I said, I'll go through each one for about 10 minutes and have 15 minutes of conversation and move on to the next one. So I'm going to ask Brett to very closely manage that time in between so we don't get too far behind. So that's the process for today. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you find this webinar, this session helpful. So I want to begin by sharing a personal experience. And that personal experience is that oftentimes you can look at your paper or your study in particular and think because it has some unique feature that will carry the day in the review and publication process. That you may look at your paper and think, well, my study's different because it has a better measure, has a better structure, maybe it's longitudinal versus some, all others are one-time studies, or something unique about your study that makes it special. And then you might also think that all the other parts are just words. You can just write those up, right? You can write a theory, you can write an intro, you can write out, but the study itself is done. So if you have a unique study, that should be what matters. That's what I used to think. And it is not usually going to work at these top journals. My experience is that having simply, a better methodological mousetrap, or the magic is in the method, you have a better study, a different study, that's going to carry the day, doesn't do it. And this in a way gets back to Sarah Rynes' earlier comment. Even though methods and theory and such can be fixed, it's got to be a unique contribution. This one slide took me 3 or 4 years to learn. I'm a pretty slow study, I will say, but I don't want you to make that same mistake. So the idea here is we have to think beyond what the study attributes are. We have to take a different perspective than getting lost in the trees relative to trying to interpret what our paper is really trying to tell us, tell others. And this is a bit of a challenge, to be completely honest, because you get mired in the details of writing a theory, writing a method, writing results, and get really deep into that, putting together tables and all of that. And now this is telling you that there's a lot more to think about your paper than just those very specific points. And that's a lesson that took me several years to learn. Now, in addition to this, another misperception is any difference will do. Even though you may think you've identified a contribution, so you're going beyond, what's unique about your study. So for my situation, I had a panel design, and other research was just cross-sectional. I thought that panel design and the snazzy analysis of the within firm changes, that's really cool stuff. Didn't work. But once I finally figured out, well, there is a contribution here, and I started writing up that contribution, I learned that isn't even enough, that there's characteristics of contributions that have to matter. Sarah, again, back to Sarah Rynes' article or editorial, this was published in the Academy Management Journal, is reviewers could still have negative reactions to contribution. So many of them would say this is too narrow or too low incrementally. So what's new here? Some reviewers will ask, the so what question. You need to do that. Ask yourself, what is the so what here? Have others read your papers? What's the so what? Sometimes we're too narrow, too refined, too specialized. The scope of the contribution is too narrow. Or some reviewers say this isn't very surprising, and they're judging against common sense. They're thinking, how can I ever how can I ever deal with a comment like that? Or there's unclear importance. Now, when Sarah wrote these 4 points, she culled these from 6 months of reviews that she had seen at the time. These are the kinds of things that reviewers were saying in response to valuing contributions. So the point I'm making is it's not just enough to identify what's unique about your study. It's not just enough to think, here's what my contribution is. We have to understand some of the properties of our contributions too, because there's a lot of misperceptions here. And you need to go and view contribution the same way you do writing theory or writing a method or writing results. There needs to be a structure to what you're doing, so you can help avoid some of this. Don't go through guesswork. It's risky to do that. And that's part of one part of insight I want you to get from today's webinar is this isn't something to take in an ad hoc way. It's something to be deliberate and careful about. Take a step back. And this is, I keep going back to Sarah's editorial here. And I think this is an incredibly insightful quotation. So I want to just tell you, just take a step back. And when I was a doctoral student, my advisor used to tell me to go walk on campus, this beautiful place there was a pond with a fountain and trees surrounding it, and a stone bridge. So go sit there on a bench and think about what your study means. Not theoretical arguments within your study, but what does it really mean? And come up with a valuable research question. And I think this quote that Sarah has is really helpful for this. Potential for your contribution is generally set at the very earliest stages of your research project. By the time the data are collected, it is usually too late to think about how to make a substantially larger contribution. That's fascinating to me. As someone who's been doing this now, as I said earlier, for over 3 decades in all capacities, that really impressed me. Because often we'll do a study and then we think, okay, what does this really mean? This is saying, let's do it before we even go through our study. Now, there's a reading I want to direct you to here at the bottom, and that helps us understand setting up important research questions. And the idea here is an important problem in theory concept becomes our guiding force of the research question and theoretical model and so on. It's really easy to read a literature and find a gap in that literature, the gap spotting approach. That's easy. That's typically what we often do as well. And we learn that as PhD students. What's the gap in the literature? This reading, and it's a really interesting, fascinating reading, says that isn't really the best way to go about this. They have what they call a problematization approach that they explain. And that is they're looking for a problem in theory or in a phenomenon you're interested in, and so on. And to set up your research question from that point, and then that sets up your contribution. So even before you get going into this, think about what your contribution is. Now, I have to tell you, I am guilty of violating Sarah's point. I start off with a contribution in my own mind, what I want to do, then I go and do the study. Study results come out completely differently. Then I try to figure out what all that means. And that's typical, I think. But that may not be the best way to go about this. And we really want to think harder up front about what's unique about the theoretical problem we're going to address, rather than do a study and try to figure out what it means. I have to tell you, I think so many papers do that. I've been an editor for, God, what is this, 2023? 25 years now I've been in the editing role. I can't tell how many papers I read or review that come across with almost no foresight as to why this problem is important, why answering this research question is important, why it's even interesting. And you're left thinking, why in the world did these people spend all this time doing this study and it doesn't even seem to have an interesting question? So that's something you can fix. And I'm going to try to help you do that. So identify, explain, and argue why your research question and the solution to it matters. And also think about it from a little different perspective, is that what's valuable about what your contribution is? What's the important / relevant insight? If you're targeting one of these theory testing, theory development journals, then obviously an insight for theory. If you're targeting a more practical journal, what's the insight for practice? If you're targeting a methods journal, obviously what's the insight for the method? And also, of course, originality. What's unique to your theory and your model? Those two tests are important. Now, for me, and I'm a strategy researcher, so I started envisioning this as how does your, a paper win in the market of ideas? And strategists, have a variety of theories to explain outcomes. And one of our primary theories is this idea, the resource-based view, that we look at resources, strategic assets, and those that are valuable and rare have a competitive advantage. And to a certain degree, we can apply that logic here. You have to have something that people want to read and value, and something that's unique. So just a really simple way to start thinking about contribution. Now, it sounds simple. It sounds obvious. But I have to tell you, so few do that. Now, just to get a little bit more specific and to add some structure to this, you can also think about what's valuable and unique relative to different dimensions. Kevin Corley and Danny Gioia had a paper in AMR some years ago, I think 2011, where they characterized theoretical advances, and they looked at them in terms of the originality. So is it incremental or revelatory? One would like to be revelatory, but most of us are probably more incremental. And then what's the utility for this, scientific or practical? So they gave us a typology to start thinking about how to view an advance and to take what's unique and valuable about your work, original and valuable about your work, and think about it in this particular conception. And that'll help you identify journal selection, choose the outlet, publish the type of contributions your paper offers. And this last sentence here, misalignment is a very common mistake and one reason for rejection. I just want to tell you something really important. Many people, and I was guilty of this too, Uh, you do your best in the paper and you think, well, I'll send it off to this top journal. I know it probably doesn't have a good chance of getting in, but I'll get good feedback. And you send it and the paper comes back and it's rejected and there's all these scathing comments about it. And I'll tell you what, that still happens even if you don't do it this way. But anyway, if you send it and it's not prepared as well, the comments you get really don't reflect on your best ideas. And secondly, you often lose the opportunity to go back to that journal. So you don't want to just send a paper to a journal hoping for feedback. You don't. You want to do that. You want to look at your contribution type very carefully and align it with the journal that is most amenable or looks to publish the types of contributions you have. So with Joya here, they would say revelatory scientific advances. ASQ likes those. Incremental scientific, I mean, there's a different set of journals. Practical, different set of journals. So just starts helping us think what's unique about our paper, your paper, and where should it go. So, now, another way to think about this was an editor's introduction by Rich McAdock and colleagues. They published the Strategic Management Journal in ways to think about how your advance, your contribution adds to theory. And they have a typology of, you can see here, several different dimensions. How do you theorize? You use an inductive approach, a deductive approach, or both, or some other method. So does that make your paper's contribution unique relative to others? How about the level of analysis? Are you able to take an explanation and apply it to a different level? Or your phenomenon, are you able to make a difference for where your topic is studied? They look at contributions in terms of, can you change causal mechanisms, constructs and variables? Can you make an improvement with those? Boundary conditions. Can you make an improvement with respect to boundaries of a theory? So really what they're doing is they're saying, let's look at the content of what your theory is and what your unique theoretical work is. And are you able to come up with new outputs from your theory? Different types of outputs from existing theory. You're able to delve more specific outputs for special cases. Can derive new outputs by combining theories. They just give us a more nuanced way of thinking about that contribution. And that focuses your attention now on what that contribution really is, along with what we read from, or we saw with Kevin and Denny's Accounting Management Review article. Now, I don't want to appear self-promoting. I'm sorry about this, but I have a paper with some colleagues that was in the Journal of Management recently, where we look at what constitutes a methodological advance. And we looked at a variety of different aspects. So if you are doing a unique method or adding to method, that may be an opportunity for you to contribute as well. And we looked at potential audience. Are you focusing something more narrow versus larger? And what's the extent of your change? Is it more incremental and small, or is it more larger? And that may be a way of characterizing your advance too, particularly if you're looking to make a kind of a double contribution, maybe a contribution to theory and a contribution to method. And you can do that. And I tell students this all the time. I don't know how effective this is, but I tell them this all the time, is that when I look at the field, our advances usually more interesting advances come from students entering into the literature, your dissertation research. And you've had a chance to focus on how a method is done, how your topic is portrayed, and you bring in a fresh set of eyes and think about what you can do uniquely with respect to method and theory. And incidentally, you're getting the latest and greatest thinking in your seminars on research methods. And that's oftentimes very far ahead of where the fields are. And that can be an opportunity for publication too. And that was true for me. I took econometrics classes, and when I looked at the management literature, I saw a gap. And I wrote some papers on methods because I saw this gap in knowledge. Of course, I problematized at the time, said, well, here's how we do it in strategy, and that's, we're behind the wall, and here's why that's important. Because you're a student, you often, if you're young in the field in this, or young eyes as well, you may see advances that are going on that the field isn't yet up to. So methods advances become possible for you. Another way to think about this is looking at your theory and your method, though we discussed this with respect to method, is that ideas go through a life cycle. And you can think of new ones versus they get refined and compared, and knowledge consolidates and disseminates and ultimately gets displaced. We can think about this in terms of research methods. In 1951, Cronbach's Alpha came out. That article has been cited 60,000 times. Or Campbell and Fisk's multi-trait, multi-method as a way of assessing construct validity, 1959. But now we have much better techniques for the last one. We have confirmatory factor analysis. So that, if we think about how to validate a construct, we start off with this Campbell and Fisk method. Or if we go back to Cronbach's Alpha, we have alternatives to that now. And that's how ideas advance and progress. We get these initial papers and we develop them, refine them, and you can do that too. So it's another way to think about contributions from a longitudinal point of view. Okay, so I think I'll stop for now and open it up for any questions. I'll ask Brat to limit us to about 15 minutes if we could. If there are any questions, I should say. Maybe raise hands.
Yeah, if you have any questions, please raise your virtual hand so we can see you. Carol, please go ahead first.
Yes, thank you very much, Don. That was already amazingly interesting and a bit, kind of worrying as well. If we think about, actually, you're very right. You have an interesting research question if you don't start a long project with that, or what is all lost. Now, it sounds very intuitive, but it's not always very practical. So, for example, I'm doing a lot of qualitative research, and access to unique data sets or so is often a crucial factor. And as ethnographers or so, we often say, when we get access to a particular contact or case or so, we jump on it and we start collecting data with a sufficient idea that there might be something interesting in it, but not being able to have very clearly defined research question up front and not knowing what happens because a lot of the exciting things emerge. So how does that link to your comment on having a very clear idea where your contribution is? Is that contradictory, or is that just a nuance of that?
It's reality, isn't it, Carol? It's just reality. You have to make the best out of the resources you have. You really do. But I would just tell you to think very hard up front as to what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. When we look at what makes a strategy effective, the ability to implement it is huge. And I think that's true here. You have your own resources, you have your own data, and if that's what you have, which we all have limited resources, we just have to think hard about what it is they mean. And sometimes, with respect to qualitative, you immerse yourself into this and you learn something you didn't expect as well. So even though your resources may be limited, and they are for most of us, having an open mind and having a questioning, curious perspective can often lead us to insights we did not anticipate. So keep your eyes wide open. One of the best, most interesting studies I've ever read was published in 1980, Administrative Science Quarterly, by Alan Meyer. It's on environmental jolts. He was doing a study in a hospital, and he had clear expectations to what he thought it would be. And all of a sudden there was a major strike. And that led to a wholly different outcome. So he had a limited resource. He was doing the type of study you're talking about, and then a major event happened. And that was a fascinating event for him. So he studied that, he learned it, and he wrote a paper that was very different than what he started off with. And it was an amazing paper, Environmental Jolts, 1980. Even though this paper is published over 40 years ago, just the process he went through would also be just a valuable one to learn, because he took this new experience and made a tremendous insight from it. So sometimes that's how life is. So I hope that's helpful to you, Carola. Thank you for your question. Thanks. Ravi?
Ravi?
Yes, I first of all want to commend you. Excellent presentation, and there's a lot out there for me to learn. I just want to add a couple of additional viewpoints on this, because your emphasis appears to be emphasizing thinking about contributions before one starts the study.
Mm-hmm.
However, my experience has been that sometimes after the study is done, the results really will unravel new contributions that are coming out. So there is a place for thinking about contributions even after the results are uncovered. And additional viewpoints are, there are some streams of research like grounded theory, where there's no prior theory or established knowledge realm out there. And that has to be recognized because you're really letting the data reveal what's in there so that you will uncover new phenomenological insights and so forth. So, and that's not addressed here a lot. And third one is, I just want to say that the point I want to make here is sometimes we are so siloed in our thinking, we don't look at bridging across the disciplines, and that's also not addressed. But this is by no means a criticism. These are some additional viewpoints I want to suggest. And increasingly, knowledge development is becoming interdisciplinary, and that has to be somewhat addressed as well. Thank you.
Ravi, thank you. That's what I wanted to bring up, and as I have different points of view on that, and that's really important. And Ravi's point, I think, raises another issue, at least from my own experience, is that I may have a clear research question and why I think that's important and why I want to do this study. And I get into the data and I learned that research question was quite inferior, given my limited capacities. That's not a surprise, those who know me. But usually I learn something new from the data and end up rewriting the paper in the first place. But we have to be open-minded and curious what we see, like I said with Alan Meyer. But Ravi, thank you for those comments. Yes, Agnieszka?
Yeah, hello everyone. Dear Professor, thank you a lot for your time and openness to sharing with us your knowledge. And this is great presentation, a lot of valuable information. I would like to ask you to share with us your reflections. I mean, many journals expect from us to provide theoretical implications as well practical implications. Do you have some suggestions from us? Should we really link and conduct them together, or rather we should be focused on the one dimension? Do you have some recommendations for us?
Well, yeah, thanks for your question. Where are you? What country are you in? Are you?
Yeah, I am from Poland, from Europe.
Oh, beautiful. I've been in Krakow. It's a lovely area. I love that. Thanks for asking your question. It's been a swinging pendulum. Back in the 80s, 90s, and this isn't relevant as much, but back then we wanted to have more equal contributions. So we would see a section for practitioners, implications for practice in the top theory testing journals. And then since then, the pendulum's really swung more to theory development, and practical implications go more for practical oriented journals like California Management Review, Sloan Management Review, etc. Those are fine journals. It's just a different perspective. I have to say, I think that the theory testing journals are really still looking for mostly theory work, and sometimes the only advances for practice are future research questions, and it really aren't very well thought out. So it just seems that the literature has evolved to the point to where you have to choose what the primary emphasis is and find a journal that publishes that type of contribution, which might mean for you, if you're doing a theory testing work, you choose a journal for that. And if you want to think about the implications and really make a strong theoretical real practical argument, you write a separate type of applied paper as well. So that may be a way of thinking about it, providing, of course, they are distinct from each other. It's really hard to find journals that blend the two anymore. I'd like to say you should have a couple paragraphs in your discussion that apply to practitioners, and there's calls for that in many of the top theory journals, but we don't often see much paid to that anymore. We just don't. It used to be in the old days, it just isn't anymore. So I think you have to choose your emphasis now. and choose a journal that will best apply. If you want a blended journal, the California Management Review is excellent for blend. They want theory and practice. And if you're more practice minded, that may be the place to start. And that's a really good one. The Sloan Management Review, another very good one. And frankly, many people overlook those journals, and they really shouldn't, because their unique experiences as authors, or if they're doing grounded theory work, they really have these great contacts and experiences. They may much better fit with those journals. So I think you have to choose, to be completely frank. So I hope that's helpful to you.
Thank you.
Of course.
Don, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Just going back to that question that earlier was asked about, contribution and qualitative study, where you may not know in advance what exactly contribution is going to be. Could you comment, please, on the role of abduction, when it comes to contribution, because where you're moving between literature and what's coming out from your data?
Yeah. For me, what normally happens is I have this expectation of what I think I'm going to come up with. And I think really hard about it. Like, is this going to be a signaling model where I'm adding a different type of signal? I'm adding a context to it, or am I adding an intervening variable to it? Something along those lines. And that does become part of it. Absolutely. But I learned usually something unique from doing the study that I didn't know about the theory. And this has happened every single time. And this is dating back dozens of studies now. I learned something from that data, or I learn it from my co-authors, and I learn it from talking to managers, the executives in the classroom, and I get some new insight on it. And that leads to another type of contribution for the paper. So the paper doesn't just offer one contribution, usually offers a couple, 2 or 3. And that abductive role often occupies at least one contribution. In some case, the initial idea is scrapped to favor what emerged from the relationships. So for example, just to make this easy, you may have an interaction term you're looking at. So you go and you decide to square it. You want to look at whether there's a U-shaped relationship between your variables. And oh my goodness, that turns out to be significant. Like, well, that changes the whole way you think about this. You think, well, maybe I should cube it as well, just to make sure that it, so you go back to your stats book, or you read an article on this, on testing curvilinear relationships, and you say, well, I have to cube this so I learn what the parameters are in this relationship. And you find that you have some sort of S-shaped relationship. Like, what in the world? And to me, in my limited ways of thinking, I probably wouldn't have come up with that S shape at the beginning, but the data tell me that. So I learn it, I go back and I reread, I end up having to go back to the beginning and start all over again. But at least there was a starting place that had some unique value in it. And I think that gets back to Sarah's point. You got to have a good question to begin with. And then that sets the frame for all this other discovery to come up. And usually, as I've said a couple of times now, the data teaches something new about your relationships you could not have imagined. And what you learn through that role is oftentimes much more, at least for me, what I learned from doing that is much more interesting than I ever could have forecasted or expected. But in some cases, you end up including both as contributions, or in some cases, you end up swapping what you initially thought with what you did because you learned so much from it. Kind of like that story I mentioned on Alan Meyer. So open-mindedness throughout the whole process has to take place. And as Robbie said, also thinking across different boundaries. I work with people in finance and accounting and learn from their points of view. That helps expand that too. So I hope that makes some sense.
Thank you, Don.
Okay, good.
Just maybe one more question before we move on with the presentation. In the chat, Vivek is asking, how many contributions paper should ideally have, number-wise? I'm guessing you're touching it soon.
Yeah, I don't mention this in the next set of slides. It's a good transition to the next set. You certainly want to have a couple. You want to have at least a couple, one for if you're doing a theory testing, one for the theory and one for the phenomenon usually. If you get beyond 4 or 5, it gets so watered down that it becomes hard to see the depth in those. There is certainly a depth for breadth trade-off, certainly a couple. I mean, that's, you want, unless it's a really deep penetrating insight, but even in that deep penetrating insight, there's going to be nuance with it. So, I mean, we do find papers with one hypothesis, but there's usually more than one set of implications. So I'd say mostly 2 to 3 is probably a good number to shoot for. So you've got one for theory, one for the phenomenon, maybe some practical implication that you saw. Although I mentioned that typically we don't blend as much as we used to. There may be some practical insight, or there may be a limitation in the method that you discovered that you wanted to address, and that becomes a contribution as well. Or you did something unique with an integration across perspectives that you didn't expect. So usually 2 to 3. When I see a paper that offers 5 or 6, I'm like, wait a minute, this is just too much. But in terms of theory, maybe redefining a concept, changing the breadth of that concept, looking at the boundaries of that concept or that construct, and then adding your content theory contribution if that's what you're doing, and certainly for the phenomenon as well, and what you think it means for the phenomenon. I think as soon as you get beyond 4, it gets really watered down. At least that's my experience. So I hope that's of some help. Okay, we should probably move on here. Now, this is this statement will probably be concerning to some of you, and particularly it would have been to me when I was first starting out. I want to talk about the discussion section of the paper. I have this quote here out of a book chapter that I wrote, but the discussion is the most critical part of your paper because that's where you define, develop your contribution and unique value added. All too often, discussions rehash empirical findings to go no further, and big red flag that the authors have not thought their way through the contribution. This is why I read the discussion first whenever I review a submission. Now, the reason I say this to you is you might write a paper from the very beginning to the very end in some incremental manner. You might expect reviewers to read your paper from the introduction on forward, and many obviously do. But there are others out there who will study a section of your paper first. Sometimes it's the method. They'll look to see what you did. And many reviewers are looking for flaws, and it's just what happens. Many also read the discussion first, and that's what I do. And the reason I do that is because that right there tells me what your research question is, why it's important, what you added to it. Now, the reason that can be a concern is because when you're young in the field, you probably will write the discussion after you've already written all these, you've done the analysis and so on, and you're tired by that point in time, and you just want to get this over with, and you just want to submit the darn thing and get it out of your hair and move on to your next thing, because there's nothing more interesting than a different paper than the one you're working on. And I have to tell you, that has been my experience. Whatever I'm working on now is not nearly as interesting as what I could be working on. So I just want to finish the thing. You have to be really, really careful to avoid that. And that's why I'm telling you the discussion is just absolutely crucial. So to me, whether I'm editing or reviewing, that's the section I go to, because I should learn what's valuable about this paper. Because that's really what we're publishing, is we're publishing contributions. We're not publishing yet another application of a theory. We're not publishing another study. We're publishing a contribution. And that's where we should find it, is in the discussion section. So what I want to talk about with this one is how to structure your discussion to make it successful when a reviewer, an editor, or reviewer looks at it. And these are just some suggestions from my point of view. And of course, there are others. First of all, and this comes from a book chapter I have on this, and it's basically, how do we write discussion sections to sell our contributions? And of course, start off with your motivation for writing your paper. So why did I really do this? And you say that in your first paragraph. Here's what the research question is, and here's why it's an important question. And then before you start writing, ask yourself these questions. How can you make this story interesting? How can you make it to where it has a broad appeal? Does it apply to a critical social issue, for example? Think about what makes your research interesting. So you really, before you even start writing this discussion, before you start writing this section, have a clear definition of your work's objective and why it's important. Keeping in mind that there are readers who will just skip right to this section. They don't care about your theory yet. They don't care about your method. They don't care about your internet. They don't care about anything else. They care about your tables. They want to see what you have added that's unique to a conversation. That's what these papers are. Is they're making a novel advance that's then based upon theory and evidence. So this is where they're going to find it. Now, along these lines, when we read a discussion section, we can very quickly get an idea of how well ripe or developed the ideas are. In many papers, I can't tell you, I don't keep track. I wish I did. They're submitted prematurely. You know, people will restate their findings, and then I'll say the discussion will be a repeat of those empirical findings. And that's, as I said in the previous slide, that's a big problem. Instead, you want to think about what those findings mean. What are the new conceptual stories that you get? And if those are not developed in the discussion section, if the content tends to focus on findings or they're linking them to support the theory or support the advance, the paper simply hasn't matured enough. When you do peer reviews for your colleagues and friends and or for the academy, and so on, when you look at the discussion section, start paying attention to, are they just restating the findings? Or are they telling me what the findings mean? And you want to know more about what they mean. So what do the findings mean in terms of supporting a novel and valuable conceptual story before submitting the paper? Let your ideas ripen before submitting them. So it's just so tempting. You've done your analysis, you've written your results, you have a limited time to get the paper done. So you write your discussion section of, here's my research question, here's what I found, voila. Well, voila is not going to be a happy outcome for you because you're going to get bad news later on down the road, because they're going to expect you to go up a level and tell you what that means for answering your question and for having an implication for explanation and having implications for your topic. And that gets back to Rich McAdock had said before about look at how you can expand your levels and boundaries and mechanisms. Look to see how you can develop a unique story. And this is where we should find it. That's the discussion section is all about, is developing what's unique about your study. And we need to think hard about this. This is a really important section of the paper. Now, typically here, many of these discussions have different motivations, and they typically fall into one of two categories, theories or findings. And so most new submissions focus on the latter. But if you intend to make a more compelling case for your paper, the motivation for the content generally becomes more convincing, particularly if you root it in existing or revising, expanding theory and making sense of it. So if I'm reading a discussion section, first paragraph, there's the research question, here's why it's important, a very brief summary of the findings. In general, our findings suggest the following, and then implications for, here's what this means for the theory, here's what this means for the topic, here's what this means for application, here's what it means for method. You know, that shows thought, and that shows it's matured, and the motivation for this has been developed. And that type of thinking will help you avoid some of the problems we saw earlier. Now, in terms of structure, you typically see four parts to these. The contribution is clearly articulated relative to the research question. So identify your research question, you come your findings and say, here's what the contribution is. And you say that in a standalone paragraph or two even. You're really clear about what your unique advance is. You explain it, and then you develop it. Now, as you develop it, you position it relative to existing knowledge on that theory or on that topic or on that method. Here's what we know, and here's how we build on it. You have to make this obvious. In fact, you may even say, here's what we know, and here's how it adds to existing logic. It is infuriating that reviewers often will just skim and not really think about what you're reading or what you're writing. So you've got to make it really obvious, make it really clear. Think about reviewers are busy and they're grading papers and they're just generally overwhelmed with various challenges in their life. So make it as obvious as possible. And finally, make sure you draw clear implications for future research. Now, as you look at this structure, you don't see much on repeating findings. You're seeing instead, here's the question, here's how we advance it, here's what we found that's new, here's what it means, here's how it extends current knowledge, and here's how it can go for future knowledge. So in my mind, when I write my discussion sections now, I use this structure to try to help keep me pointed towards moving forward. Here's what I found. Here's exactly what I think it means. It's exactly what I think it contributes. Here's how exactly it builds on other studies, other theories. And here are the linkages. And these are the new research questions that come out of it. To a certain degree, this is a bit of marketing, but it's just clear. Now, there's a very helpful reading that I should have included it and I forgot to, and it's that Daryl Bem, a psychologist at Cornell, wrote this book chapter years ago called How to Write the Empirical Journal Article. I'm going to put this in the chats. I want you all to see this here. Okay, Daryl Bem. I'm just going to put Bem. How to Write the Empirical If you Google that, you'll find it. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is this is absolutely a wonderful article for our book chapter. But the reason I want you to look at this is because he talks about features of writing that make for effective papers. In fact, now he's a psychologist, so that may be really helpful for many of you. For those of you that are economists or something, like, I don't know about this, but it is really helpful just as a general structure, no matter what your orientation is. And one of the key insights he has is papers should have an hourglass shape. They start off very generally with research questions, and they get progressively narrow to the hypotheses and to the method. Then they start coming back out again from the results to the discussions. The discussion section is where we want to explain the general implications for what we're doing. So Daryl Bem's How to Write the Empirical Journal Article will give you some more insights into this. During my early years as an academic, I had a colleague.
Don,
yes.
Don, may I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
Your reference didn't show up in the chat.
It didn't? Okay, let me try that again. That's strange.
Unless it was sent to someone individually.
Maybe that happened. Let me just change it to everybody. Everyone, thanks for letting me know. Okay, let me try that again. Bam. How to Write the Empirical. Yeah, it looks like it's already. you guys are so fast. Look, it's already showed up there. Journal article. There. Brad, can that one be seen now? It looks like
yeah,
it's already.
We can see it.
I see. You guys are already ahead of me on this one. When I was an assistant professor, I really struggled writing papers, and I had to hire a copy editor because my writing was so poor. And I had a colleague who told me to write this paper because he often used it. And he's since become quite famous. And I'm not going to say his name because I won't embarrass him, but he would say before he writes every article, he would read this paper. And I'm saying he is quite famous now. And if I said his name, you'd know it. But he said before every paper he wrote, he'd read this. And they had this book chapter has examples of good abstracts versus bad abstracts, and good sections and bad ones. So to check this out. But anyway, this is my ideas on presenting the discussion section here, so I can move forward. Okay, so let me stop for now, and we'll take maybe a 10-minute conversation if there are questions. Anybody has them on what we're talking about with writing a discussion section?
There was a question earlier in the chat about writing contribution in a PhD thesis as opposed to in a paper.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Don?
Yeah, whatever your advisor tells you to do, to be quite honest. And those, a lot of that isn't meant as a tongue in cheek either. It's what I'm talking about with much of my presentation day is communicating with reviewers. And that's the idea of communicating with your audience. And I think asking what you're and having clear communication with your advisors, what's going to really matter with all of this. But clearly the thesis, you have more room to extend what you think it means, and you can go through your results in more detail. Excuse me. You can draw implications in more detail. With a journal article submission, we collapse these things so much where every word, every sentence, et cetera, counts. But there, I think you have more room to explain it. But I just work through drafts, work through outlines with your advisor. Always work through outlines before you put a lot of effort into writing something up like that. Frankly, I've always found outlines to be one of the most effective ways of doing anything. So you work at that level, you can move ideas around, you can drop ideas, you can develop the ones that really gain traction. So I'd make an outline, meet with your advisor, and keep going through that process iteratively until your advisor agrees, then I'd flesh it out. Any others? Okay, good.
Yeah, if you have any questions, please just click on the virtual hand so we can see you.
But I think
There's
I
a
put them
question
all
in the chat from Ksenia.
we
I
can
have
move on.
seen how
Okay.
there's a question in the chat from Ksenia. I have seen how some scholars state that they are committed to accept papers with non-significant results. However, there is a conventional assumption and the reality that journals accept and are interested in significant results only. Could you please share what journals are more open to such results that are not significant? Or from your point of view, what is the percent of the hypothesis should be confirmed to be considered as enough a contribution for the top journals?
Yeah, that question is part of a larger conversation right now on questionable research practices and scientific misconduct and publishing bias, which has somewhat been shaping the academic literatures for the last 10 years or so, is that there's such an emphasis on significance that it's led to people to engage in questionable research practices such as data snooping, p-hacking, and so on, just to get significant results because journals only publish significant results. Now, in response to that, some journals, and I know in my own area, like the Strategic Management Journal, are now willing and are careful to publish articles that may not have significant results. In addition to that, some of them are changing their reporting standards to where they want confidence intervals rather than p-values. I know some psychology journals are doing this as well, but clearly there is, cultures are hard to change. Practices are hard to change. But I can tell you that it's going to be difficult to publish an article that has no findings whatsoever that meet the threshold standards. That said, you don't have to anymore have all of your findings meet some conventional standard. And frankly, I think it's been that way for quite some time, that a blend of those is necessary. But as I said earlier, the Strategic Management Journal has explicitly stated that the significance of findings is not a prerequisite for publication. I haven't seen many other journals say that, come out with those statements, that they publish significant and non-significant results. But I think what we have to do is keep our eye, though, on the ball. And what I mean by that is the story that we get out of our findings. But you don't have to have, and I was looking at one of my papers I published in 2001. I think I only had about 50%, actually 1997. It predates many of our viewers today, unfortunately for me. But I think I only had about 40% of the hypotheses supported. So I think what really matters is if you still have a story you can tell. And you don't have to have all of your hypotheses supported, and you probably are not going to be able to get something published without any of them supported. But really, it comes down to the story you're telling. But journals and editors are recognizing the problems with a focus on significance values. They certainly are. And some of them are making specific policies to address those. So I would look at the particular journal you're interested in and recognize that the editors are probably very much aware of publication bias, but you do need to have some, supporting evidence for a story you're trying to tell. And that supporting evidence usually means a confidence interval of a relationship that does not involve zero. So you have to have at least some. So I hope that's of some value to you. Thanks. Tatiana, you've had your hand up for a little bit of time. Hi.
First of all, thank you for this talk and for this presentation. The question I would have is linked to this fatigue that you spoke about when we come to the discussions. Often we find ourselves tired to focus on, and I can see myself as linked to my work on a theoretical article that I've been working on for a while, and it's linked to my thesis. And my question is, do you have any suggestions? Do you have any practices that you put in place to overcome this fatigue, just to be able to have a fresh eye, to have the energy, and maybe to think about the discussions and contributions earlier in the writing process?
Yeah, I do. Just, it's an N of one, a case of one. I always write the methodology first whenever I do a paper, and I get that done, and I polish it and polish it and polish it till it's as clean as it can be. Then I put it down and I think about what it means. Then I write the discussion next, and I when I'm still fresh. And I have learned that writing theory is the easiest thing to do because it's just structured logic. It used to be hardest, but for me now it's easiest. So I usually write early enough in the discussion where I'm not tired. And then after I write the paper up in the introduction section last, or actually the abstract last, but that usually is very simple after it. So I write in a different order than you might expect. Then I put it down for a few weeks and come back to it and just really intensely focus on it, then put it down and come back to it, put it down. And usually after doing that 3 or 4 times, the pieces each individually get developed and they start integrating across well enough. Then I get some peer review on it as well. So I reorder the process and I break it down into pieces. And I do the hardest section first. I think there was Mark Twain had this old quote, the humorist said, if you have to eat a toad, eat it first thing in the morning. If you have to eat 2 toads, eat the bigger one first. And I think there's, as silly as that sounds, there's some logic in it. I always do the hardest section first when I'm still freshest. And that way I don't have that fatigue. That's how I've dealt with it. And just realize it takes multiple iterations. Some of these papers have been rewritten 20, even 30 times. And that's sometimes what has to happen. But that's during the whole review process. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks for your question. We have time for just one more. Mohammed and I've got to move on to the final section for today. Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, for the time, for the question. So I followed the conversation about the insignificant results, and I was wondering, how do you go about discussing your results when you have like a qualitative paper where you don't actually have room to bring in insignificant results? If you have a thought about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mohammed. Well, this conversation is more about theory testing rather than theory development. So that would be a whole different way to go. But there, of course, you're coming up with propositions. And I think that would that would qualify what you say about the propositions you're putting forward. So you might say, here's the proposition we're offering. However, we need to develop it further to understand the properties behind its various facets, its various dimensions, why we didn't see as much evidence for it. And so I think you just have to qualify it. But I'm not an expert in qualitative analysis. I'd say I'm not an expert in anything, but I don't have much experience with it is probably the best way to put it. I would rely on a qualitative expert to help you with that one. I really would. So I'm gonna have to defer because I don't want to give you the wrong advice. I think your outcome whatever it is your outcome is, you can then, if it's propositions or it's a model, you can offer your qualifications then. So, but thanks for your question. I'm sorry I can't answer it. I just don't want to misadvise you with this. I've written a few content analysis papers, and that's as close to qualitative analysis as I've ever gotten. And there I'm letting the data drive my findings. So I'm just looking and connecting everything as closely as I can to what I find to make the cleanest, shortest story possible. But I'm sorry about that, Mohammed. Thanks. I mean to have to dodge it, but I'm going to have to. Okay, let me just go into the last section today, reviewing and editing. This is a section that I hope will be valuable to you, even though reviewing and editing are far from what you're thinking you're spending your time with right now. But our community's sustained by the fact that we're willing to share with one another. And we volunteer our time either as reviewers for a program or for journals and so on. But we can't just submit papers and not expect to get feedback freely. We also have to be willing to give feedback, and that's how our communities operate. So anyway, I want to talk about reviewers and editing. Contribution is often perceived here as obviously subject to and prone to disagreement, but there are some parameters and some objective properties that we can identify to help us understand them better. And I had one model that I used when I was early in my editing days, where I was editing 3 papers a week, so about 150 a year. And I had to develop a way to kind of get to the essence of the contribution really quickly and make an editorial decision of whether or not we should go forward with the paper or not. And from this point of view, this is an active editor role. This is not simply a vote counting role. Well, 2 reviewers said no, 1 reviewer says yes, therefore we reject. And it's not that. It's about looking at what's going on and using the reviewer's insights to help make an informed decision. Realize too that editors often give revise and resubmits because of uncertainty in their minds. So to the degree that you have a strong enough argument to create that uncertainty, maybe you'll more likely get a revise and resubmit. But anyway, as I was going through all of these reviews, and then this goes back to 2002 to 2004, and at that point we were only 4 associate editors at AMJ, which is where I was at the time. Now I think the associate editor numbers are quite high, and I don't think they're doing 150 papers a year anymore. But just out of sheer necessity, I had to develop a shorthand, and here's what I did. I developed like a 2x2 that included 2 axes, theory and topic on one, or theory on one, topic on the other, or a phenomenon. And I looked at whether they were new or they were current for each. And putting the 2 of them together, I came up with the 2x2 framework. And here's what it looks like. So as I would read a paper, I would, of course, go right to the discussion section and read the discussion, say, are these authors doing something new for theory? And is this a new theoretical topic? Or I would look at it, is this theory that they're doing not new? They're applying what we already know, but the topic is also not new. So I would basically try to put the paper's contribution to one of these 4 boxes. Is the topic we've already been studying, but this is new theory for the topic, or is this current theory and the topic, is not new as well? So for me, I would start trying to place readings or our submissions into one of these boxes to try to make sense of where they were. Now, there are any number of axes you could do here. But this is just to help manage this intense flow that I had. Normally, I could put a paper into one of these 4 boxes. And the reason that was important for me was it allowed me to see whether or not the paper had the potential to contribute to what the journal was seeking, which was new theoretical advances. So how could I move if I had a paper that was in one box, how could we move it to where we wanted it to be to publish? And could it be moved there? And that really became the whole goal, is where does this paper fit? And what can we do as reviewers and editor to help move it there? And those that could be moved ended up getting published. And those that particularly had new theory and new topics. Those were the ones we really wanted to have. So one of the papers I accepted was a paper by Rajesh Agarwal and colleagues on new spin-out development. And I'm going to get to this on a slide after this, but they were in one part of this, they had a new topic and new topic, but they were using kind of current theory to study that. So the reviewers pushed them to develop the theory, and we're able to move them into this box here, new theory and new topic. And that paper ultimately won the best paper award for AMJ for 2005. So for me, it's not that this box, not that my shorthand made that difference, but it helped me see how to help guide the review process to get the paper to where it could achieve its potential. And this is just a shorthand model that you might want to use now to look at what you're doing. Now, for me, much of my research would follow over here. I'm doing current theory and I'm applying it to an existing topic. And, I have several articles in like second tier journals that do that, because that's what those journals may want. Or you may be in an area where you're taking new theory, or you're taking a new theory to an area or new theoretical innovation to a current topic. And those are ways of making theoretical advances that oftentimes the top journals will accept. So let's say you're examining a topic and a relational view hasn't been examined yet, or a learning view hasn't been examined yet. You can take new theory into this area, perhaps even contribute to the theory as well and move up to this other box here. But this just becomes a way of thinking about how to critically identify your contribution relative to the topic and to align it with the types of contributions that journals seek to use. So to me, this just became a way that I could very quickly make sense of what a paper was doing. I had some colleagues once, we were at accounting management, and they were saying, so-and-so said you can look at a paper in 10 minutes and tell whether it should be rejected or not. And they were having this kind of a harsh conversation about this. And I felt bad about it. And I said, no, I don't think that's right. I think what you need to do is look for the potential of a paper. And that takes a lot longer than 10 minutes. And in my mind was this 2x2 matrix, was how can we find the potential of a paper and push it there? Now, unfortunately, and I don't see a lot of this happen when I submit my own work, which gets rejected often. And I have to come back and reacquaint myself with this too. Well, what am I doing and where is it at? And why am I not communicating this effectively? And that's difficult to do. Talking about this and doing it are different things. And, we have to be really clear about what it is we're trying to offer and what we're trying to advance. So I'm going to suggest you really hone in on what's new and valuable in terms of the motivation for your paper, the theory, the topic, and the evidence. How can you further develop it? And if you're an editor, how can you get reviewers and authors to engage with one another? Which usually means, keeping a positive environment, recognizing there's no such thing as a perfect paper, which I'll talk about in a minute, and get out of their way and let them work. I have at the bottom here, I edited the best 2005 AMJ paper, and this evolution occurred through these reviewers and editors working in close concert, or reviewers and authors working in close concert with each other. Sarah Rynes, who I cited earlier, became editor of AMJ after our time as associate editors. And she asked me to write an editorial to describe the process of managing this review. And I have it here in 2006. And Rajesh Agarwal and her colleagues wrote an accompanying note. So if you're interested in seeing how contributions develop, you may want to check out that correspondence. So I provide the editor's point of view, and they provide the author's point of view. And they have an acronym they come up with how they manage the review process successfully. And I think it could be very insightful for you if you're interested in how the authors saw what we were doing, and you can see how I saw how we were doing. They expressed their frustration with us, and even to the point of saying they wanted to make dolls and throw darts at us. But we really did push them on this. But they pushed back and did a great job on their paper. But anyway, you can get a case study from that. So anyway, let me just end with a kind of a closing slide here. You need to really define your work's contributions. You've got to take that initiative. Don't let others do it for you. Don't let reviewers tell you don't have a contribution. Don't let reviewers guess as to what your contribution is. Take it. Be clear, but don't oversell it. If you oversell it, if you make conclusions that aren't supported by your evidence, the reviewers are going to see that. But be very clear. Don't let it's almost like in politics, you know, politicians try to define the other, try to define each other and so on. Don't let that happen to you. Don't let that happen to your paper. Don't let reviewers define your paper doesn't have a contribution or it's just an empirical contribution. Critically evaluate your discussion section utilizing any one of these matrices I've shown you today. Correlate and Joy is a great one. You know, that's really helpful. Go back and look at what Sarah Rynes found from evaluating critiques. Look at our longitudinal model that we had in our methods contribution. Are you able to advance your literature? Look at Rich McAdock and their article on content of contributions. So just think critically about it and look at how you can structure your discussion to help make those ideas come out. And make sure too, you're really clear on new research opportunities, spanning new research questions and studies. So from your point of view, make sure you've addressed these as thoroughly as you can. Because as Sarah's quote said, you know, and it's written over 20 years ago, but it's true today, contribution is a separate thing, and reviewers are paying attention to that separately than even though they may think that all other parts of your paper can be fixed. If they don't think it makes a good contribution, they're not going to be interested in it. I know ASQ has said have one idea per paper and make that idea really good as you can. Reviewers and editors, I want you to recognize that most submissions are works in progress of some form. Although you may not see them that way, they are. And we need to recognize that our comments can be constructive and help those papers develop. Try to be developmental and see if you can shift the contribution types from empirical to theoretical. Look to see if you can get new insights into a topic. And finally, and I hope that editors will see this, you can publish only the best work you receive, not the best work ever done. I have learned, you know, having been on several editing teams now, the first-year editors often reject about everything they see. And I have theories for it, and you could have theories for it as well. But only after they've seen they're rejecting, you know, 99% of what they get do they think, well, maybe we should start not being so harsh by years 2 or by years 3. My conversations and my experiences are, it seems like some people think they have to publish the best work they ever get. They're ever done, but all they can do is publish the best work they receive. And I wish that editors would be a little more amenable to that. So anyway, that's what I have today. And I hope that that's of some value to our participants. And we have a few minutes. If anyone has any remaining questions, I'll be happy to try to answer or dodge them in the case of Mohammed's question. So I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Don. And we have Ravi who already raised his hand. Ravi?
I'm trying to respond to the chat. Anne mentioned that she has difficulties with the differentiation between phenomenon and theory. And she says that from her perspective, the phenomenon looks a lot like theory. And how would you define the separation between phenomenon and theory? The reason why that chat remark attracted my attention is when you made the distinction between topic and theory, I needed further clarification on that. And in my own mind, you know, what we set out to do, a theory or a topic or a specific research, or even a research framework, is really an abstraction of the complex reality out there. And the complex reality out there is the phenomenon which we cannot really address in any single study because there are so many variables. So every study is just a small abstraction, a model, and therefore is limited. And the extent to which we reconnect our limited foray into new knowledge development into this broader universe of knowledge is where I think we have to discuss in the paper.
Sure, of course. Yeah, when I say phenomenon, some papers do focus on phenomena, others focus on topics like an action, like an acquisition, for example. So are you making a contribution to the literature on acquisitions? And are you making a contribution to an explanation of acquisitions? So that's the idea of topic. And that's just to get you to think about the distinction between those. That's what I meant with that. But thanks, Ravi. Yeah. Amy, I think you have your hand up. You're muted, Amy.
There we are. Now I can see the unmute button. Thank you for a thought-provoking talk. I had a question about sort of one of your comments about choosing one topic per paper or something like that. I'm not sure I fully caught actually what you said about that. And I just wondered if you could say a little more. For me, I'm trying to publish my PhD studies, and it's like I have 3 studies, but there's a lot in each one. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about those, choosing which point. I mean,
yeah,
it's going to vary, but yeah.
Yeah, happy to, Amy. First of all, congratulations on finishing your PhD. That's terrific. Congratulations on that. A couple of quick comments. The statement about one topic per paper is ASQ. Says have one idea per paper, and that the idea is to be as clear and clean as possible. It's just an informal guide they have. That's what I had said, is the more ideas you have, it's like the more things that can go wrong. And they want to see a breadth for depth trade-off to really focus on one idea and really develop it fully. That's ASQ's policy. With respect to dissertation papers, you and many of the other listening in today have a real challenge, because you have experience doing a dissertation, but you don't have probably much experience with publishing in the top journals yet. And the liability there is the top journals have the toughest standards to pass. So you are being asked or required by your institutions to publish in those best journals with the least amount of experience. I went through that, and it was an excruciating process. I started my career off as at Penn State, and it was quite a clear number we had to meet. If we didn't meet that, we would lose our jobs. And I saw people losing their jobs, and it was very stressful. Dissertations also have emotional components to it. So what you need to have is an advisor or someone with experience at navigating the publication process, take you under their wing and give you some help. I'll be honest. I mean, that's what most people are. I mean, I'm just saying this in general terms. But take the cleanest idea that you have of your 3 chapters and the ones that you think are going to be clearest for you. Try to reduce your emotional attachment to those. Try to get a paper from that, and by all means get as much peer feedback as you can on it before you submit it. Not just from your committee, but from others that can criticize it and help you with it. It took me, and it's taken many others that I know, many years to publish their dissertations. I finished my dissertation in 91. It appeared in 98. It got rejected at 3 or 4 different journals, my main paper. And ultimately I had to write spin-off papers out of it that were very simple, very clear, and I published those instead. So recognize that's not an unusual phenomenon, that we want to say everything that's unique and valuable about our dissertations, and they become sprawling, confusing papers. So try to make it as clear and as concise and as straightforward as you can, and treat it as just another paper, because that's all it counts as, is just another paper. Now, along those lines, resist the temptation to salami slice your work as well. It's important to make sure that you have meaningful contributions. Just make them very clear in terms of how they're defined. I've seen too many people do such a narrow contribution and gets rejected, as Sarah Rynes' comment I posted earlier. But you also want to make sure that you're offering enough development within that ideas to make it interesting. So I wish I had better advice for you. I'd have to look at what you're doing in order to be able to advise you. But since you're entering a process where the reviewing standards are the highest and you have the least amount of experience, you got to find a way to bridge that gap. And for me, it was a really difficult process. and you need an advisor who can help you, or someone who can give you feedback, or some ones that can give you feedback, make sure you read that paper by Daryl Bem that you're structured. Find examples in the journals as well. That didn't really work for me, that latter one. Like I would look at AMJ Best Paper Award and look at how they were structured and try to simulate my paper out of that, and that didn't work. Only when I got around to reading Daryl Bem's paper and getting peer feedback did I really start to get through that process. But those are some process suggestions, and I hope there's some value on that for you, Amy. Good luck. Again, congratulations.
Thank you so much. That is actually very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Don, a question in the chat from Nazreen. We need one idea per paper, but could you please tell us more about questions? We might have more than one paper related clarifying questions in a paper. Is it a negative signal?
Not at all. Not at all. There's that article I mentioned earlier about research questions that deals with problems versus gaps in the literature helps address this. If you have questions that deal with multiple gaps in literature, then that would be a problem. But if you have multiple questions that relate to a single problem, that's okay. So go back and look at that Alvesson and Sandberg article, and I'll just type it back in here just as a reminder. I think this is AMR 2011. That would be a really helpful way of thinking that. So your research questions are focused around a single problem rather than having multiple questions that deal with multiple gaps. Then that isn't going to work very effectively. And in that regard, you'd need to focus and choose which one you'd be interested in. I think I put them all to sleep. Any others?
Not at all. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat or hands raised.
Okay.
So I take it as a signal, using Nazreen's word, that we could bring this conversation to a close.
Sounds good. Well, thanks everybody for attending. I hope there was some value to all of this for you, and I appreciate your time and wish you all the very best as you navigate this process. A colleague of mine, former colleague of mine named Don Hambrick, you probably heard of, used to say there were two main ingredients to being successful in this industry: thick skin and persistence. And he's certainly a great success story to follow. So keep at it. And I wish everybody the very best. So thanks, Brad. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you very much, Don. And thank you everyone for joining us today and contributing with your questions and comments. See you next time.